So, a bit of background to this talk. This is basically me ranting internally, which when I was asked to kind of like present externally, I was like, oh, I've actually got a talk, basically already done, because this is the amount of ranting that I do internally. So, a little bit about me. I used to work at Just Eat, the takeaway company. I worked there for about 4 years. I was the SEO guy there, tech SEO guy there for quite a while. And now I work for a Norwegian supermarket that unless you're Norwegian, Finnish or German, you'll probably never have heard of, and we've only just entered those two markets, so that's basically who I am and what I do. I've been agency side, client side, I've been in supermarkets, I've worked for charities, I've been everywhere. So, best thing at the moment is the fact that finally, it seems like data-driven has started to kind of get more search volume than best guess, which is kind of interesting in itself because it's, why do people search for best guess? It's a weird thing to kind of search for. Data is completely meaningless. You finished, Nick?
Just trying to make your slides.
Thanks. Cheers. Data is completely meaningless without understanding the data. It's amazing how often people do this kind of great kind of analysis of data, and I kind of go, no. I probably pissed them off a lot, but I don't really care too much. This is kind of one of my favourite examples. And this example is a very, very old example. I'm sure millions of you have seen it before. But basically, they wanted to put more armour onto the planes, and they couldn't quite figure, well, they could kind of see where they should do it. It's really obvious. You put it where it gets shot. But then a guy called, well, his name is Abraham Wald. He basically said, well, we're only looking at the planes that come back again. So why don't we put the armour where it's been shot and didn't come back? Because that's actually where it's more critical to put the armour. And this kind of made a lot of sense to me. It's a great example of why and how an understanding of the data, the gaps in the data. There's so many examples of these online where you kind of go, the data actually is misinterpreted. And I believe that in SEO, it's one of the biggest examples of where the data is misinterpreted. So yeah, do you have the right data? Are you interpreting it correctly? Are you providing the right data to your clients or internally or whatever? And you know, this is an example from an agency that I saw. It was like, your website has poor, deep linked pages. They basically said one of the critical factors, a high priority thing, was some of the pages, it was too many links away from the home page. And then when I looked at the examples they were given, it was a paginated page equals 50 in page. And I'm sitting there kind of going, well, if I kind of brought that up in terms of the internal link architecture, I did some maths, and it would mean that we'd have to put millions of links on millions of pages, and it was just going to be an absolute mess. Another favourite one of mine is the kind of the Yoast SEO score. I mean, a lot of the time we kind of talk about these scores, we talk about these things, and it's like, it's not important necessarily to get the green ticks on everything. Don't be tool driven. I mean, John talked about this earlier on, how tools are actually a great way of kind of understanding things at scale, but you're almost better off using your brains, using insight, than doing it in that way. Keyword density is one of those classic myths in SEO. We often talk about this metric as though it's kind of an important metric, and then people are kind of going, it's not an important metric, we should ignore it. But equally, you should actually make sure you do mention your key terms on pages. So it's one of those things that fully understanding what the hell we're talking about makes an SEO guy a good SEO guy. One of my favourite examples is the organic conversion rate. Your organic conversion rate has dropped, or your bounce rate has gone up, and this is bad. One of the things that I found online was a quote from HubSpot, which was, why does bounce rate matter? I know that Stacey's spoken about bounce rate, and Omi's spoken about bounce rate already, so I'm just going to bore you a little bit more on bounce rate. But basically, what HubSpots have said is if the visitor didn't find what he or she was looking for, or the web page is too difficult to use. And these are the two examples that they give, and I think these are actually really bad examples. It's also kind of being used in correlation studies. Basically, people saying bounce rate correlates with you know, rankings. And so, you know, there's an important reason why bounce rate is actually, in my opinion, a really good and useful metric, but you need to understand it better. And this is my example. If I search for, I mean, I mentioned before I work for a Norwegian supermarket, so I check this more often than I should. I should be able to remember it by now. Basically, how much hand luggage can I take with me? And it seems that I can take 20 kilograms. So if I search for that, land on this web page, I'm happy. But this is a bounced journey, and this is why bounce rate as a metric in an organization is often bad. Often you add great content to a website that negatively or positively or well basically impacts the bounce rate. And the point is that if you don't understand how this happens and you start to look at bounce rate not in a segmented understanding way, then it's the most useless metric. The same with things like I want to call free mobile. Basically you land on the page, you find out how to call it, you bounce. And so this is why it's really, really important. There's another good example with like correlation studies. And has anybody ever heard of Google Correlate? This, by the way, is a list of all the kind of tools that Google's killed off recently. It's the Google graveyard. And Google Correlate was killed off. But still, I got access to it a while back and I kind of had some great fun with it at the time. This is one of my favorite. Did you know that ibuprofen correlates with doner kebab? I mean, that makes sense, basically. You go for a night out, you know, you get a doner kebab, the next morning you probably want ibuprofen, so that actually makes sense. But why does doner kebab and Wix website correlate? Wix website is a CMS. I can't understand that one at all. And, you know, I probably shouldn't show this because I know the guys at Wix quite well and they're really nice. But Wix website also correlates with does weed, and I don't really fully understand that. So basically, I can't understand a lot of the correlations that you find because actually it's just completely randomly and completely meaningless. And so understanding this is a really, really important thing to kind of understand. So, you know, there's a lot of kind of data out there that maybe isn't quite as accurate. People say this will happen, this doesn't happen, and you know, we know that things will happen differently. My point is the data in its own, you kind of need to understand it better. I mean, talking of the bounce rate, one of the things that I found on one website that I worked on, I think Stacey was there at the time, we were an agency together, and it said, good news, the new site has a bounce rate of just 3%. So, you know, I looked at it and they were right. According to Google Analytics, the new bounce rate had a bounce rate of just 3%. But of course this meant that the analytics was screwed up. Us trusting analytics is only good if we know that the analytics is reasonably accurate. So I actually fixed that. And then some pages actually had events and no page views and session users but no sessions. How do you have pages that have got users but no sessions? I mean, basically, you screw up your analytics implementation, you screw up the data, and all you get is kind of some meaningless weirdness. And this is very, very common. Basically, make sure your analytics configuration is good enough that you can trust it. The other kind of classic example in analytics is when we kind of put a new checkout onto a website, and your conversion rate has dropped, and you know, this sounds like a really bad thing. I mean, it really does sound like a bad thing. Until we started looking at the data, and we started noticing that, you know, Google paid search converted at 3%, but Facebook was converting at 42%. And Google was converting at 35%. And this was kind of weird. I mean, that's an incredibly high conversion rate and an incredibly low conversion rate. That just didn't make any sense until we started figuring out that there was an attribution issue with the social login. So, you know, there's loads of ways in which data just lies to you because somebody has misconfigured it. I mean, this isn't even a misconfiguration. This is something where this happens, it just needs fixing. But, you know, when we actually looked at it, when we looked at the data, it did turn out that actually the conversion rate actually improved because we could recalculate this ourselves. But kind of applying the original data just didn't make sense. Google Analytics will not be 100%. There is no way it's going to be completely accurate. I mean, lots of us block it. Let's be honest, we're geeks, we're nerds. We often have tools which block it. We often have tools which kind of just interfere with it. And often, you know, we don't click the accept cookies button, or there's some reason why it's not 100% correct. I've found many, many websites out there where not all pages are tagged completely. And it is really, really quite important that you actually make sure all your landing pages, all your pages throughout the site are tagged if you're using Google Analytics. The other thing people don't understand is sampling. Google often gives you a small percentage of actually the data that it's got stored. Even when you're using Premium, when you use the interface, it still kind of gives you a sampled level of data. So it doesn't matter what you're doing, unless you're actually looking at the data in a kind of concise and accurate way, it's going to be kind of relatively inaccurate. And understanding this is fine. The other things that we found is things like UTM parameters are screwing up your attribution. They're often really badly done. They're lowercase, uppercase, mixed cut. There's so many reasons why I've seen these to be completely wrong. And one of the first things I tend to do is when I'm auditing them, I find out where all this weird stuff is screwed up. One of my favourite examples here was when I was working on a big project for Just Eat, and we basically created these new pages. we kind of worked on a big project to kind of get the kind of KFC for brand basically ranking as much as possible. We got so much coverage in all the newspapers. I was really glad. This was really, really making a significant impact. And we had links, of course. But what was really interesting was the link had a UTM parameter which said it came from a tweet. So all of the traffic that came in from the Sun said it came in from Twitter. And so, of course, the social media team is sitting there kind of drinking champagne, and everyone else is sitting there kind of going, this is a bit weird. And I'm sitting there kind of going, yeah, you screwed up. Social team didn't like me after that. But it is kind of weird when you get things which are kind of mislabeled, misdirected, and it is not easy to necessarily fix everything. There's no way you can go back in time and actually fix some of these problems. The other thing that I often find when I'm looking through these things is internal folks aren't segmented. And this is happening at Oda, for instance, at the moment. One of the things that I found is our biggest 404 page is an internal tool, which means that actually internal people are going to this particular tool, it's not there, and so it's kind of creating a thing from the main website. So we're getting loads and loads of 404s, and I'm sitting there kind of going, you just got to ignore that. I have sorted out that problem, but it's not a clean solution at all. I just ignored it. And the other thing is spam. Historically, there used to be huge amounts of spam. Even our tools, the tools that we use, for instance, Screaming Frog or Content King or any tool like that, if you're using Deep Crawl, or what's it called now, I can't remember. Yeah, the new tools and apps like that, they will fire some analytics tools if they're not set up correctly, especially if they're homegrown, home-built. So it is worth having a look at that. And I've talked about bounce rate. CTR and average position are two which I see in every SEO report, and it bugs the devil out of me. Because I know people have just created these in Data Studio, and they look great, they're fantastic, they're wonderful. But average CTR is another meaningless value. Now, this example here, you can see where our average CTR dropped massively from something like 20% down to nearly like 5%, and our average position dropped massively. And the reason that this actually happened was because of the fact that we actually opened up the website. So suddenly we got millions of terms instead of a dozen terms. We got thousands of terms which were, well, basically we opened up the shop to the kind of the general people. And this means that basically suddenly we were ranking for thousands of terms, just not as well. Our traffic went through the roof. Our revenue went through the roof, everything worked much better. I was really happy, but if we were being kind of graded on the click-through rate or the average position, then it looks like we actually failed. And basically, we often see things like an organic conversion rate is 5%, paid conversion rate is 25%. So, there's clearly an issue with our organic conversion rates. And so, when we look at it, we kind of understand the fact that we actually don't compete necessarily on the same terms. Organic traffic, we often want it in areas where it's awareness or consideration, rather than just the straight conversion thing. We also send traffic to places which might be out of stock. So we, as organic traffic, we can't always switch it off and switch it on again. As soon as stock comes in, stock comes out again. Whereas paid traffic, they can kind of go, oh, okay, so in stock, out of stock, it's much, much simpler. Basically, segment the data as much as possible. And when you're doing brand, when you're doing organic, there is kind of a lot of simple ways to do this. One of the things that I love doing, by the way, is a tutorial on Omni's website on how to do this, is basically using Data Studio and the case statement. You can actually kind of go, anything that matches this is brand. Anything that doesn't match this is non-brand. Fair warning, non-brand is heavily reduced because when you do use this, Google kind of removes about 50% of the non-brand type keywords because of the way in which Google kind of goes, oh, we won't give you all the private information and everything. Another favourite example of mine is conversion rate by time of day. Now the reason I say this is when I was working at Just Eat, if we started segmenting the conversion rate through the day versus through the evening, they were completely different numbers. And this was really, really important because, of course, people don't order pizzas and kebabs at midday, or they might do. I don't personally, but basically, I tend to order my takeaways in the evening, not in the middle of the day or in the morning. So time of day actually makes a massive difference to some of these sort of bits of information. Different websites, different values. And me sort of talking about time of day, that might be less important to someone else who it might be something much more critical. The other thing that I quite like doing is looking at whether or not a user is logged in or logged out, because again that might make a difference. I mean, Stacey was working on an implementation for Odeon, the cinema chain. And of course, conversion rate for people who have bought like an unlimited ticket versus somebody who hasn't bought an unlimited ticket, they're going to be completely different values. So understanding if somebody's logged in or logged out and the impact of having a conversion rate is massively important. Amazon Prime, for instance, I bet that Amazon Prime users versus non-Prime users, totally different set of metrics. And the other thing to remember, of course, is track if it's out of stock. You know, this is really, really important. How often I look at websites and kind of go, oh wow, bounce rate for these pages is really, really high. Oh, it's all out of stock. And I kind of want to look at how do I improve the bounce rate for out of stock pages. I might want to look at that as a challenge. And I might want to look at all the ones that are in stock and see if the bounce rate for those is good. Bounce rate is a kind of example as to whether or not it's going to be a good kind of conversion rate. So it's kind of a soft conversion rate there. And you know, one of the things I would say is really, really important is to continuously monitor. Spend your time not looking at Google. Start that again. Don't spend your time basically looking at Google Analytics and kind of going through report after report after report. Build a dashboard that gives you all of this information. By the way, dashboards that you build for you aren't always the same dashboards you build for senior management. And you know, build a dashboard of data you want to monitor and kind of control and see. It doesn't necessarily mean you're reporting on it. It means that it's a soft conversion rate or something which you need to see if it goes wrong. I love Data Studio. It's one of my favorite tools out there. It's now just been rebranded as Looker. I don't really know why, but basically it's got a bit more commercial. APIs, there are so many APIs out there, from the toolkits you're using to everything, from Google Sheets to you name it. Google Search Console, it's out there. And cloud computing, as Omi's already mentioned, this is going to be such a big thing going forwards. It's absolutely critical. And the best thing is, if you're using something like Data Studio, you can monitor 5 or 6 different sites at once. If you've got 5 or 6 different websites, you don't want to look into 5 or 6 different analytics accounts. Use one kind of data report, one Data Studio, and that works incredibly well. And if you use Data Studio, you can start to kind of segment it by a device type, for instance. You can kind of go, okay, just show me the mobile or something like that. So that's really, really important. There is hundreds of connectors now for Data Studio. Every time I look, that number goes up. There are so many connectors now that it really does make a difference as to what you can use that data for. And as I've mentioned before, the more you segment it, the more you kind of break it down, the better it is. And you can do this within Data Studio, which is really, really simple. Again, this exact same example is taken from Omi's website, where you can kind of go, okay, take the landing page of being the home page, the blog page, the account page. By segmenting and dividing up the data, this really does mean that the data becomes more insightful, and you're not kind of looking at site-wide bounce rate. You can look at the bounce rate for the blog, which will, or the pages not the blog. The account page is going to be completely different to the order pages. These pages, being segmented, gives you so much more insight. And you can even blend data, which is kind of quite cool. You can actually blend data from the sort of like your Google Analytics account right through to your Google Search Console account. So suddenly data which historically you had to kind of mesh together using VLOOKUPs and everything like that, you can do really simply and easily. And you can even get it emailed to you every day or twice a week or how often you want to. I actually would basically get some things like this emailed to me 2 or 3 times a week because I wanted it to kind of remind me to go and have a look and deeper dive into it. I mean, I had rules so as it didn't clog up my inbox, but it did work really effectively for me, reminding me to kind of go and check stuff. The other thing you can do is use things like Google PageSpeed in the cloud, which will kind of pull data into BigQuery and then it will pull it into your reports. This is something that we built at Just Eat, again. It was built based on something which Stacey's mentioned, or Simo Ava's blog. He basically said, you can do this, and we went and we did it. And the reason that this works incredibly well is the fact that we can then kind of look at any changes quite quickly and plot changes over time. Nothing's perfect, because this is kind of a cloud computer based in the middle of nowhere looking at stuff. It's not real user data, but it's still a great indication of when things go wrong. It is always, you can always expand on this as well. So for instance, I mentioned the fact that there's the brand terms, and I also mentioned the fact that we wanted to compete on KFC terms. So I can segment terms into brand and also into the KFC terms. And I can keep doing that as much as I want to. And this is really important for me to kind of really keep digging down into the data to make sure it's as good as possible. We can use loads of tools to monitor our websites and pull this via APIs into any tool that we want to, like Data Studio or whatever. And Little Warden, which was mentioned earlier on, is another tool which kind of goes, okay, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to pull this information into Slack, I can pull it into wherever. So basically my advice is don't use tools that don't have good API access. When I'm investigating tools, the biggest question that I have, the most important information that I want from them is, does it integrate with everything that I've got? Which is again what Nick was talking about at one point earlier on. And Content King, for instance, that gets pulled straight into my Slack account. And it means that I can basically not worry about all of the emails, all the notifications, and if something comes into the Slack account, then I can then kind of go, hey, by the way, we need to get this sorted out. I can redirect different things in different ways. It's always good fun. And again, I've actually got a Data Studio report based on the Content King data coming in. So, there's so many ways in which I kind of pull the data in. I very rarely go into half of the tools until I see a problem and need to investigate further. And, it is biggest challenge in SEO is kind of understanding where all of this data comes from and all the data goes through to. One of the things that I found very fascinating was when Photobox, about 3 or 4 years ago, actually switched off its entire marketing spend to kind of then figure out what's working. What they did was they kind of switched on different bits and pieces. They kind of went, what is working? And this was a slow process for them to kind of go, actually, lots of things doesn't quite work. It's always worth noting that basically, in all data, there's agencies and lies, everything, everywhere. Basically, don't believe anything without kind of fully understanding the data. I'll skip that one. But basically, what I'm saying is make sure that you can get all of the data into Google Data Studio or dashboard of your choice. At Oda we actually use Looker, which is another Google product the same. I still personally use Google Data Studio to basically pull everything in correctly, but yeah. So yeah, basically use intelligence. Take data to understand what it is. Don't take data at face value. Don't understand the fact that if your average ranking has dropped, this is a bad thing. Look at revenue, look at all those different metrics, look at conversion rates segmented by country, by device, by page, by channel. And it is worth noting that the more and more that we kind of look into this data, the less accurate it's becoming. We're relying on cookies, we're relying on JavaScript, we're relying on bits and pieces, which, TikTok, for instance, when you open a link coming into a website as a paid channel, it actually it opens it up in a separate browser, which is not attributed to anything else that you're doing. So, there's massive challenges out there, basically, of kind of understanding the data as it is. So, yeah, thank you.